Hello, my name is Maureen Schell, and I have with me today Sarah Allgeier. Allgeier, all right. And we are here to talk today about maple sugaring, which is a major part of our history here in America, and especially in Northwest Ohio. It was an important activity for the pioneer settlers who came here, and at one time this was the western frontier. And as the frontier, it was difficult to get certain things. And sugar was something that it was hard to get. Sugar came from the French West Indies or from Europe, and it came on ships, and it was a long voyage. The sugar that was made in the French Caribbean was closer and less expensive, but it was made under horrendous conditions. And so it became popular to promote buying maple syrup and maple sugar instead of cane sugar that had been produced under slave conditions in the Caribbean. So this was important as the settlers moved westward and they were unable to find trading posts. They were unable to find goods except at forts and from traveling traders. Having sugar just to preserve foods was a very, very important. No refrigeration, no way to keep things preserved without sugar or salt. And so maple sugar was the answer. Maple sugaring had been done here in this part of the country since before this country was discovered by the Europeans. The Native Americans had been doing it for such a long time that they had perfected it. And so they taught it to the settlers. And the settlers took to it very quickly. It became part of their routine. And during the late winter, early spring, that's what your apron is for. You know, it's okay to get your apron dirty.
Except now my apron's dirty.
That's why the women on the frontier wore this apron. By the end of the day, it was dirty. Sarah's working on churning butter, which is something that would be done at sugar camp if you had the ingredients necessary. And so she has a small churn, a traveling churn. One of these would have been carried with the settlers as they came west because it would have allowed them to churn butter as they were traveling. Whoever was sitting on the wagon seat with the driver would be able to churn butter on the trip. Other things that would have come on the trip would have been items like our tin can for getting a drink out of a lake or a river, and our soap for washing up after. This is lye soap, handmade, very harsh, very strong smelling, but boy does it clean. And this would have been kept under the seat. This is something you would have found at sugar camp as well, because when you packed to go to sugar camp, you could be there 2 or 3 weeks, and so you would take supplies with you so that you could clean up. That was important. So sugaring on the frontier by the settlers was a little bit different than sugaring was by the Native Americans. The settlers brought metal tools that made it much easier for them to do sugaring. They brought, this is a little bit more modern one. It has an adjustable bracket for the bit, but this is a carpenter's brace. I don't have a bit in here. Here we go. Here I have a bit. And there we go. This is a carpenter's brace. The bit was twisted into the brace. The reason it's called a brace is because of this knob right here. This knob is not for turning. This knob is for bracing. And when you were tapping a tree, you would put your bit against the tree, and then you would lean your body against it to give the weight of your body to the job of drilling. And that would make it so you're actually bracing the bit against the tree with your body. And that's why this is called a brace and bit. It was a more modern tool, and the blacksmith could make them for you, and it made it much easier to drill the trees. Originally, when the settlers came, they used bits for the trees that were very much like the ones that the Native Americans had used. They were wooden. They were made from twigs or small branches. These have a nick in them to hang a bucket from. Originally, the buckets were set on the ground, and then later they developed buckets that could be hung. So these are handmade wooden spiles. Now, the settlers called these spiles because that is a French word that means to spill. And they spilled the sap directly into the buckets. Originally, the buckets that the settlers used were called firkins. They were buckets like this. This is actually an antique firkin. It's kind of seen better days. Its lid is in the shop for repair. And as you can see, the staves are coming off of it. But this is a very old firkin that was probably used under a tree in Vermont to collect sap. And you'll notice that the bottom of the bucket is wider than the top. There's a reason for that. What do you think the reason might be for that? Sarah? Why would the barrel be wider at the bottom than at the top?
Stop things from getting in as easy.
Stop things from getting in as easy? Okay. That's a good answer. Yes?
Keeping it from tipping over?
Keeping it from tipping over. That is exactly right. Because the things that are going to get into it, like deer and raccoons, are going to pull on it. So both answers, good answers. And when they pull on it, it would tip, and there goes your sap. The animals know that the sap is sweet. They love it. So at night, when it would get cold and the sap would stop flowing, the buckets would be covered. They all had lids. This is a small reproduction, but it gives you an idea of what the buckets were like. Here's the lid. The bucket was wider at the bottom than at the top. And so you see these all over New England. They're very popular. They still make them today. They're tourist items. They're a very popular style of bucket to use for all kinds of things because New Englanders have been doing maple sugaring since before the United States was the United States. And they're used to having these buckets around, and they've adapted them to use for all kinds of things. So you do see them in all different sizes, as you'll see. This is a regular frontier bucket that would not be used for collecting sap, but it might be used for other things while you were at sugar camp. It has been lined with beeswax to make it more waterproof and to make it food safe so that you could actually prepare food in this. You could carry water in this for drinking, whatever you needed it for. It's a very nice little bucket. But anyway, the settlers also, instead of using open logs to cook their sap in, used kettles. Now, they had the smaller kettles like the Native Americans did, but they didn't use them for cooking sap. Instead, they used the family kettle. This is the family kettle. And every family that came west to the frontier, which would have been the Ohio frontier, brought one of these kettles with them. If they could afford a copper kettle, it would be copper because copper was not as heavy, it was easier to handle, it heated more quickly than cast iron. So, this is a copper kettle. It is an actual antique that was brought to Indiana by a family that came after the Revolutionary War to claim their land in Indiana that was given to them by the state that they fought for in the War for Independence. So this kettle is well over 200 years old, and we have no idea exactly how old it is, but I actually was lucky enough to obtain it from the family who had owned it from the beginning. It had been handed down through the family for many years, and the woman who owned it had an antique store. When she was closing her store to retire, I had bought several things from her in the past, and I went to talk to her about the kettle. And she said, well, I'm not sure it's for sale. And I said, does it hold water? And she said, well, let's find out. So we dragged it out of the barn and we started to fill it with water. And she said, well, what did you want it for? And I said, education. And she said, what do you mean? So I told her what we did, that I worked for a history center and that we did all kinds of history education, frontier settlement, and that I would use it at the log cabin there, that I would use it for maple sugaring, that I would use it for several things. And she said, hang on a minute. And she went inside and called her mother, who was like in her 90s. And she came back out and says, Mom says you can have it if you promise to use it for education. And so she sold it to me for a ridiculous price. And I could not wait to get the money out and give it to her because I was afraid she'd change her mind. And that was probably 20 years ago, and I have kept my promise, and we are still using it for education. And my kids always knew if the house burned, they were supposed to grab that first.
After the pictures.
And so this was handmade by a blacksmith. It's hand-rolled copper. It's hard to tell it's copper by looking at the outside because you don't clean the outside. That patina on the outside protects the copper, and it's a good thing. But you can tell by looking at the inside that it is a copper kettle. The bale was hand-rolled. This is a 30-gallon kettle. So, what would you use it for besides making maple syrup?
Cleaning.
Cleaning? Cleaning what?
Clothes.
Clothes. Okay, laundry. Let's see, what else? Somebody always says soup. 30 gallons of soup is a lot of soup. I don't think that I would use it for soup, but I might use it to make potted meat. Potted meat was made when you butchered a hog or a goat or a cow, and the meat that couldn't be used for other things would be shredded and cooked with spices and fat. And then that would be packed in crocks to be used for cooking stews and soups and things all through the winter. And that would be made in the big kettle. The big kettle was used for dyeing. Women would dye cloth. Sugar that they would buy would come wrapped in indigo blue paper. And I don't have any of the indigo paper, but I do have a sugar cone. This is cane sugar. This is the way they purchased it on the frontier. This is an 8-ounce cone, a half-pound cone, which might be all you were able to buy from the trader in the fall, and you wouldn't be able to get more till he came back in the spring. So that's one of the things that made maple sugaring so important. But women could use the blue papers. They would collect them, and then when they all had a couple, they would boil them to make a vat of blue dye. And then they could dye things, and they would get together and do that. So this could be used for, well, you're too big and I'm too big. We could use the water after we got done bathing the children in here to bathe ourselves, couldn't we? All right. So this could be used for bathing your children. And when it was time for maple sugaring, everybody got their kettle and put it in their buckboard wagon and headed for sugar camp. Several families would share a sugar camp if they could, because then it was less work for everyone. People would take lean-tos with them and get set up. They would set up a nice area for sleeping so that people could take turns sleeping. Everyone would bring their supplies and work together. And then at the end, they'd have a party. But they would have things to do at sugar camp besides sugaring. What would you want to do at sugar camp besides sugaring? Not churning.
Never.
Is that what you're doing there? Churning some butter? Well, let's see your churn. I see you're cleaning it off. Okay. So this is just a small traveling churn. Oh, all right. And oh, I see you're starting to get butter. You've got some peaks there on the top of the churn. Oh, nice. There we go. And eating was an important thing at sugar camp, and there was always someone working on food. There would be people cooking pancakes, because you can eat pancakes with your maple syrup. If you were in Canada, instead of pancakes, you would be making dumplings, and you would cook them right in the syrup. And boy, are they delicious. We have many times boiled eggs in the sap that is cooking, and there was always someone cooking over another cooking fire to make sure that everyone who was working had something to eat. So, of course, eating things with maple was a lot of fun. Cornbread, soaked with maple, that was good. I like it, don't you?
Mm-hmm.
So, this is not a trade kettle. This is a finishing kettle. And it has a round bottom. This is a kettle that's used over the fire. Now, when you're not sugaring, this could be used for cooking all manner of things. But when you're sugaring, this kettle was used for finishing. And what that means is when the big kettle gets to the point where the sap starts to thicken and become dark brown, it sheets off the spoon. When you lift the spoon, instead of the syrup dripping or falling off in a rush, it sheets off slowly. When that starts to happen, the syrup gets moved to the finishing pan because you can burn it very quickly in the large kettle and you have more control in the smaller pan. So this was used for finishing. And so I'll set it right here by the big kettle. And it takes 42 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup. So that gives you an idea of how much you've cooked down from there to there. And it takes even more cooking to get sugar. You have to reach a point where your sugar starts to granulate, your syrup starts to granulate on the side of the pan. And when that starts to happen, you'll take a scrub brush like this and scrub it back down into the syrup and keep working it until you can tell that it's crystallizing. Then you have to very quickly get it out of that pan and into a mold. If you're making sugar, you can put it in shallow bowls like these to make large rounds of sugar to be stored. It'll fill about half, you fill about half of the bowl, and then you can pull those out and those can be wrapped in waxed linen or in cheesecloth, and then they can be stacked in a bucket like one of these for storage. And so these were used for making sugar cake. But soon, people who were bored during the long winter on the frontier started making molds for their sugar. We have a heart mold here. This is a reproduction. This is also a reproduction of an actual antique mold. This is a clay mold. These were made of pottery clay, and they were easy to make, but they broke easily. We've been very fortunate with this one. We're really lucky that it's still in one piece, because I've had it for about 10 years now. But we haven't used it to make sugar, and that's part of the reason that it hasn't been weakened, because the temperature differences weaken the pottery. It has not been fired. So, this is one of my favorites. You know, the largest producer of maple in the world is Canada. There's a reason there's a maple leaf on their flag, and it isn't hockey. And the Canadians, when they were making maple to sell, discovered that they could get molds from China in big barrels that they could use to make maple cakes that were fancy. Well, in China, these were used for making rice cakes that were painted intricately and were very fancy for Chinese New Year and other holidays. But here, they were used to make maple sugar. I got this one, and it's still in such wonderful condition because of its subject matter. Can you see what it is?
Is that a bat?
It is a bat. And because bats are not considered lucky here in the United States, and they were very superstitious about them on the frontier, this was never used. And so, and since I have a special place in my heart for bats anyway, I was really excited to find this one. But this is a very old mold, and it came from China with other molds that are probably long gone. And so, molding sugar is something that we still do today. So, that was a very, very popular thing. The sugar that was made then is very dark and thick and rich and smoky because of the smoke from the fire. Syrup that's made over an open fire tastes different than syrup that is made in an evaporator. It does have a smoky taste, as you can tell, and it's very, very good. This is a very small jar of syrup that we made in the kettle. And some years we do actually use the kettle to make syrup. It just depends on when our when our activities happen and how the season falls, because you can only get sap from the tree at a certain time of year. The story about the hunger moon that the Indians tell says that after the hunger moon, the tree will die if you take the sap. And that's true. But the reason is that the sap is food for the tree. And a maple tree is a hardwood tree. During the winter, when it freezes, the sap, which is mostly water, what would happen to that sap, Sarah?
Freeze.
It would freeze, and it would crack the tree. And so, to protect itself, the tree drops its sap down into the roots below the frost line. And down there, it collects even more water from runoff from snow and any precipitation that we get. Then, in the spring, on a day like this, when it's cold at night and the sun rises the temperature during the day, the sap also rises. The sap starts to come up into the tree because the tree is warmed by the sun. And later in the day, when the sun starts to go down and the temperature starts to drop, and it drops below 40 degrees, the sap also drops back into the roots to protect itself. During this time, when the sap is moving up and down in the tree, this is when we can take the sap from the tree. The tree's not using it yet, and it's moving in the tree. Once the buds set on the tree and the temperatures stay above 45 degrees, the sap stops moving and starts working for the tree, and we can no longer take it from the tree. So, the hunger moon is just passed. The warm days are with us very soon. The taps will be pulled and the trees will stop producing. So that's how this works. So that's why everyone moved to sugar camp when it was time, because you don't stop. Once you start tapping the trees, you boil constantly until you cannot take any more sap from the trees. It's a constant process. You can't turn it off at night and go home to bed. And so everyone takes turns. This meant that for people who had been cooped up all winter long, this time of year was an important social event. They would all get together and find out who had babies, who was getting married, who died, who was sick, who was waiting for letters, who had new animals, who had animals that had died. All of those things, all of that gossip that you needed to know would be shared at sugar camp. Music would be shared at sugar camp, and games would be played. If someone had a fiddle or a banjo, they would bring it with them. The children brought toys to play with, and people who whittled might be working on making a toy like this for the kids to play with at camp. All of the children had jobs. Some of them collected twigs for the fire. Small wood burns hottest and would create sap, would change the sap into syrup a lot faster. So the kids would collect all of the broken twigs and branches that had fallen in the sugar bush during the winter. A sugar bush is just a stand of maple trees. And they're called a sugar bush because back at that time, a wild area of trees was called a bush. People went into the bush. And so the sugar bush was sugar trees. And so people went to the sugar bush, they brought music, they brought toys, they brought their skills with them, they brought their stories with them, and they brought their quilts and their blankets so that they could stay warm. Everyone brought their kettles, everyone worked together. The men would take turns stirring. The men would take turns filling the kettles, emptying the sap buckets. The women would take turns stirring. The children could stir. Had to be careful though. But it's very interesting. When the sap is boiling in the kettle and you are stirring, if you reach out and touch the edge of this kettle, it doesn't burn your hand. The heat is down where the liquid is. And so you could actually grab the edge of the kettle. So it wasn't a serious thing for the kids to stir, and they got a kick out of it, but they got tired of it very quickly because it's work. But the whole idea is to evaporate 80+% of the liquid from the sap, leaving behind the syrup, and then the sugar. And in order to do that, all that steam has to come off of the kettle. And the faster the sap moves, the faster the steam moves. And so stirring hastened the process and made it much more efficient. All right, let's see. Anything else?
I think that's about it.
I've got some nice books here that if you're looking for good books to share with your students or your children about maple sugaring, this is an exceptional book. The story about a pioneer boy. The Log Cabin in the Woods. This book's been in print for a very long time. It's all about life in the log cabin. There's a very detailed chapter about maple sugaring, but there's a lot of other wonderful information in here too, and children really enjoy this book. The Big Tree by Bruce Hickok is one of my favorites. It is a timeline of a maple tree that the seed fell before the Revolutionary War, and the tree is still standing today. And the story goes through the timeline of the tree. It is a sugar maple. It details maple sugaring. It talks about the trees around it being harvested, homes being built. The illustrations are wonderful, and the story is very, very good. Where's my maple sugar illustration? There we go. And it's a wonderful story that puts maple sugaring in a wonderful context for children and for adults. Making maple syrup is for people who want to try it, even if you just want to try it on your grill at home. This is a very good little text by Noel Perrin. It tells you what you need to set up basic sugaring, whether you're going to use one flat pan over an open fire or you're going to buy a small evaporator. And so this is a very good place to start. And this is an award-winning book by Lois Ellard, who is a wonderful author, about, here we go, the teachers left me a note about this book. We love this book. It's loaded with information about maple trees, and it leads students naturally into taking an artistic look at trees. Each page is like an invitation to try something new. So the teachers that I shared this with in the Perrysburg schools left that note for me, and it truly is a wonderful book, red leaf, yellow leaf, all about a maple tree. And the illustrations are lovely, and it's a good story for younger children. So we have something for everybody there. And any questions? Any questions? No? No questions? No questions? All right. Well, maple syrup is something that has been a part of our history for a very long time. During the Revolutionary War, when it was difficult for people on the frontier to get things, maple sugar solved a problem for them. It created a sugar supply. It added to the health of their diet, and it was an activity to help build communities. It was the very first American product that was used as a campaign not to buy something. The Quakers, during the start of their campaign against slavery, focused on maple sugar because cane sugar that was shipped to this country was produced under abhorrent slave conditions. It was an extremely dangerous activity. Many people were maimed or killed. People were often burned to death or fell into the vats and died. And they adopted the term blood sugar to protest buying this sugar as a way to stop slavery, and encouraged Americans to buy maple sugar. At this time, several prominent Americans, George Washington, Tom Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and other people, all agreed and backed this movement. Washington and Jefferson planted maple trees on their plantations, which was a good idea, but they didn't get much maple because their plantations were too far south and the trees did not produce. But Benjamin Franklin, who was a very crafty man, he bought properties in Pennsylvania that were already covered with mature maple trees and made quite a bit of money doing maple sugaring. And so he took it to the productive level. The first companies that produced manufactured equipment for sugaring, such as this spile, started here in Ohio, because Ohio was the beginning of maple sugaring as an industry. And eventually, as Ohio was cleared for farmland and so many of these trees were removed, sugaring moved back east into areas where it was difficult to clear and maple sugaring was already well established, like Vermont and New York and Massachusetts. And so those companies have moved there, but many of them started in Ohio. Ohio is the 5th largest producer of maple in the United States, in the world. The first largest is Canada. We actually beat Michigan, which surprises me, because Michigan, being where it is, and has always had a great deal of maple sugaring, but in Ohio, the Amish people who do their maple sugaring regularly every year and do it on a large scale, they push us over the edge every year, and we manage to beat Michigan in manufacturing of maple sugar. So it is a very interesting product that has been used to further our economy, raise our awareness, improve our diet, and it's been here since before we were. The Native Americans were doing it long before the Pilgrims arrived. And so today, maple sugar is recommended as an alternative to processed cane sugars because the body uses it differently. It has less calories per teaspoon and is much healthier. So there we are. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maureen. That was very educational, and I'm so glad that you were able to share all of your knowledge, a lifetime of knowledge, with everybody.
Well, I wish we'd been able to actually get together this year. I miss it. But I'm glad that we were able to do it, and I want to thank Sarah for being with me today. Do you have butter yet? Oh, look, you can see the butter around the top of the churn.
There, she has come a long way.
Yep, she's come a long way on her butter making. So thank you, everybody, and we hope to see you next year.
Thank you, Maureen.
Okay.